Have you ever imagined a future where some US states decide to break away and become part of Canada? It sounds unbelievable, but in today's politically divided climate, this idea might not be as far-fetched as it seems. Imagine waking up to the news that part of the United States is now officially Canadian territory. Some states already have deep cultural, historical, and economic ties with Canada, making the transition more plausible than you might think. If a state ever felt disconnected from Washington, could it realistically break away and join its northern neighbor? While this may seem like a wild idea, history has shown us that political and economic shifts can reshape borders over time. Could we witness a real-life separation in the future? And if so, which states would be the most likely to make the move? Before we jump into 10 US states that could leave for Canada, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Number 10. Alaska. Alaska is arguably the most likely state to leave the US, and for some unexpected reasons. Even though it's an American state, it's physically closer to Canada than it is to the rest of the US, sharing a border with Yukon and British Columbia. Interestingly, Alaska wasn't even part of the United States until 1867, when it was purchased from Russia. Because of this unique history, many Alaskans feel geographically and politically isolated from the rest of the country. Did you know that Alaska actually has an independence movement? The Alaska Independence Party has long pushed for the idea of either becoming an independent nation or even joining Canada. Culturally, many Alaskans live in remote areas, value self-sufficiency, and have lifestyles similar to Canadians in rural regions. However, here's where things get complicated. Alaska heavily depends on US military funding and oil exports, making any attempt at separation extremely difficult. Additionally, its geographic isolation from Canada's major cities would pose serious challenges for trade and infrastructure. But given its history and location, could Alaska one day become Canada's next province? It's not as impossible as it sounds. Number 9. Maine. Maine might not be the first state that comes to mind when thinking about joining Canada, but its location and history tell a different story. It shares a long border with New Brunswick and Quebec, which has led to deep economic and cultural ties with its northern neighbor. Maine's economy is heavily reliant on industries like forestry, fishing, and tourism, sectors that are also major parts of Canada's economy. In fact, many of Maine's rural communities closely resemble small towns in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island rather than cities in the U.S. Politically, Maine is one of the most progressive states in the country, with strong support for universal health care, climate change initiatives, and social justice, all values that align closely with Canada's. With a small population and a lack of major industries, transitioning to Canadian governance might actually be easier than for larger states. But there are obstacles. Maine receives significant federal funding from the U.S. government and benefits from military protection. And despite its cultural and economic ties to Canada, its American identity runs deep. However, with its close ties and shared values, could Maine one day become part of Canada? It's more possible than you think. Number 8. Washington State. Washington State is another strong candidate for a potential switch to Canada. It shares a border with British Columbia, and its largest city, Seattle, has strong trade and social connections with Vancouver. Thousands of people cross the border daily for work, travel, and commerce, strengthening the already deep ties between the two regions. But it's not just geography. Washington also shares many political and social values with Canada. The state is known for its progressive policies on climate change, healthcare reform, and social programs, which align closely with Canada's priorities. However, breaking away from the U.S. would be complicated. Washington is home to global tech giants like Microsoft, Amazon, and Boeing, which are deeply integrated into the American economy. The state also has a strong U.S. military presence, particularly in Puget Sound, which would create additional geopolitical challenges. Still, with its close economic ties, progressive values, and cultural similarities, Washington could be one of the most realistic candidates for joining Canada. Number 7. Vermont. At first glance, Vermont might not seem like a likely state to leave the U.S., but it shares many similarities with Canada. The state is known for its progressive politics, love for nature, and strong support for social programs, all of which align with Canadian values. Vermont has long advocated for universal health care, environmental protections, and government-funded services, ideas that are core parts of Canadian life. Geographically, Vermont's landscapes of mountains, forests, and lakes closely resemble Quebec, and many Vermont residents have deep family ties to French-speaking Canadians. However, Vermont is a small state with a modest economy based primarily on agriculture and tourism. Transitioning to the Canadian economic system would require major changes, and the U.S. government would likely resist any attempt at separation. But with its shared values, cultural ties, and geographic proximity, could Vermont actually join Canada? It's a possibility worth considering. Number 6. Minnesota. Minnesota might seem like just another Midwestern state, but its deep historical and cultural ties with Canada make it an interesting candidate for separation. Many Minnesotans have ancestral roots in Manitoba and Ontario, and the state shares major trade relationships with Canada, particularly in agriculture, forestry, and energy. Politically, Minnesota has long been a supporter of progressive policies, much like Canada. It prioritizes healthcare, public services, and environmental protection, making it a good fit for the Canadian system. The state even has French-speaking communities, further strengthening its cultural ties to its northern neighbor. Of course, integrating Minnesota into Canada wouldn't be easy. The state has a strong economy and a large population, and shifting away from American governance would be a massive undertaking. But with its close ties, shared policies, and strong economic connections, Minnesota could one day consider making the jump. Number 5. New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a state that prides itself on independence and self-governance, but what if that independence meant breaking away from the US and joining Canada? While this idea might sound far-fetched, the state actually shares some surprising cultural and historical ties with its northern neighbor. Many New Hampshire families have French-Canadian roots, dating back to centuries of immigration from Quebec. In fact, northern New Hampshire has a deep connection to French-speaking Canada, with shared traditions, languages, and ways of life. Even geographically, its mountains, forests, and small-town charm are almost indistinguishable from the Canadian Maritime provinces. Politically, New Hampshire is unique. While it has a mix of liberal and conservative ideologies, its emphasis on personal freedom, strong community values, and progressive social policies aligns well with Canada's governance style. The state has also been at the forefront of debates on healthcare reform and environmental protections, two key Canadian priorities. However, there are challenges. New Hampshire has no major cities and a relatively small economy, meaning it would need to adapt to Canada's economic structure. And, of course, the U.S. federal government would strongly oppose any attempt to separate. But with its historical connections, shared values, and deep cultural ties to Canada, could New Hampshire make the switch one day? It's not as crazy as it sounds. Number 4. Michigan. Michigan is one of the most deeply connected states to Canada, both economically and geographically. Sharing a border with Ontario, Michigan has long been a major player in cross-border trade, particularly in automobile manufacturing, agriculture, and energy. Cities like Detroit and Windsor are essentially twin cities, with thousands of people commuting between them every day for work and business. The Great Lakes region also ties Michigan and Canada together, as both face similar environmental concerns and economic opportunities related to water resources. Politically, Michigan leans progressive on many issues, especially in areas like healthcare, labor rights, and social justice, values that match up closely with Canada's policies. Still, given its strong economic ties, shared values, and cultural similarities, Michigan is one of the most realistic candidates for a U.S. state that could join Canada. Could we see a future where Michigan is a Canadian province? It's not impossible. Number 3. California. California might seem like the least likely state to leave the U.S., but in reality, it has several reasons that could make joining Canada a surprisingly logical move. As the world's fifth largest economy, California already operates almost like an independent country, setting its own policies on climate change, healthcare, and social justice, all of which align closely with Canada's priorities. For years, California has led the U.S. in green energy initiatives, pushing for renewable energy, environmental sustainability, and climate protection, issues that Canada also prioritizes. Politically, the state has some of the most progressive policies in America, including support for universal health care, higher wages, and strong government programs, all of which match the Canadian system. Economically, California is already one of Canada's biggest trading partners, especially in technology, agriculture, and entertainment. Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and major agricultural exports like wine and produce all have strong connections to Canadian industries. But here's the challenge. California is massive, with a huge population, powerful industries, and deep reliance on U.S. federal infrastructure. The transition to Canadian governance would be incredibly complex. And of course, the U.S. government would never let California go without a fight. Still, if any state could function independently and later join a neighboring country, California would be at the top of the list. Could we one day see California, Canada, on a map? It's a fascinating idea. Number 2, Oregon. Oregon might not be the first state that comes to mind when thinking about breaking away from the U.S., but its progressive politics, environmental values, and deep connections to Canada make it a strong candidate. Like Canada, Oregon has been a leader in climate policies, renewable energy, and sustainability, making it a natural fit for Canada's green initiatives. The state is also known for its social programs, with strong support for universal health care, public education, and environmental protections, policies that mirror Canada's priorities. Culturally, Oregon shares a lot with British Columbia, especially in its outdoor lifestyle, liberal social policies, and eco-conscious mindset. The state's landscapes, including mountains, forests, and coastlines, look almost identical to its Canadian neighbor to the north. However, there are challenges. Oregon has a booming tech industry and major trade ties with the U.S., meaning a transition to Canada would require major economic adjustments. And like the other states on this list, the U.S. government would likely fight hard to keep Oregon in the Union. Still, with its progressive policies, environmental focus, and shared values, Oregon is one of the most likely states to consider a move to Canada. Number 1, New York. At first, the idea of New York leaving the U.S. and joining Canada seems completely absurd. After all, New York is one of the most influential states in America, home to Wall Street, Broadway, and a massive global economy. But surprisingly, New York and Canada share deep economic and cultural connections. The state has extensive trade relationships with Canada, particularly in finance, technology, and energy. In fact, New York City has one of the largest Canadian populations outside of Canada, and many New Yorkers have family roots in Quebec. Politically, New York leans heavily toward progressive values, with strong support for universal health care, social justice, and environmental protections, all of which match Canada's governance style. The state has also been a leader in green energy and public transportation, policies that are closely aligned with Canadian priorities. Still, with its shared history, economic ties, and progressive politics, New York might be the most surprising but realistic candidate for a U.S. state that could one day join Canada. Final thoughts. While the idea of U.S. states leaving to join Canada may seem unlikely today, history has shown that political and economic shifts can change borders over time. Many of these states already have deep cultural, economic, and political connections with Canada, making the transition at least theoretically possible. Could we actually see one of these states leave the U.S. and officially join Canada in the future? Which state do you think would be the first to make the move? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.